All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting daily vlog. This is Daily Vlog 2025, day number 35. There we go. And I'm a little late. I know. So, today, first things first, I need a drink. Because, of course, I forget to get a drink before doing this. Would it really be a daily vlog without me for forgetting my drink? All right, so update on me. I'm alive. Still not doing great, but well enough to do this. So, what I want to talk about today, well, I early access to the 2024 Monster Manual started today. I have looked through the majority of it. I've not looked through every single monster stat block because tried doing that. I think I got through, like L or M, and I just went, okay, my brain is liquefying at this point. But I got a good idea about the new Monster Manual. Planning on doing an in-depth review on it. But I wanted to give my kind of first impressions of it because I think it kind of highlights a point that I hadn't quite realized about running combat in D&D in general, and just like combat in tabletop RPGs in general. So the Monster Manual in and of itself is fine. I think given the choice between the legacy monsters and the equivalent new monsters, I like the new ones better. And I'll explain why in a little bit, but I think they're a little bit better designed, which they should be. They've had a decade to figure out how this game works. And I think there's a few aspects of the newer monsters that I think just works better when running a tabletop RPG. And I think one of the things that has been most interesting to me is one of the things that quite a few different monster stat blocks had was if you get hit by this attack, you have to make a save or something else happens. An extremely common version of this was poisoned attacks. If you got hit by a poison attack, you would have like a con save, and if you failed like a con save, you'd take additional damage or something else would happen. Those are not completely gone in the new Monster Manual. However, a lot of the attacks that used to be, if the attack hits, make a save. If you fail, bad things happen, are now just, if the attack hits, bad things happen. And I think that's an overall benefit for combat, mostly because a lot of monsters, if they have an ability like that, they will have some other ability built in that either gets more powerful or has some way to interact with that condition that they just inflicted, which is great. I think that's really good monster design. However, if for whatever reason you can't inflict that condition, the players are rolling too high, the DC for that particular check is just really, really low, or you're using kind of a large group of lower level monsters, anything that involves a saving throw, they're just not going to fail it. And that means, the design of the monster just isn't going to work. Like a good example, I think it's a wolf or a panther. I can't remember which, but it's not an uncommon thing. There's a few monsters that have it, but basically, tiger. I know tiger specifically has it. They have this thing where if you move at least 20 feet before you use one of their attacks, you knock the target prone. And if the target is prone, you get a free additional attack on the target. The monster itself is balanced around the idea that the tiger gets all of those attacks. It gets to knock him prone and it gets that additional attack. If for whatever reason you're not able to knock the target prone, I can't remember if the tiger has a save against the prone or not. But if you can't knock the target prone, then the tiger is a really, or if you can't get that 20 feet of movement up to get that prone, then the tiger is basically useless. It's just a really, really boring, hit point sponge that does a slight amount of damage. And there's quite a few other creatures that fall into that same problem. If people aren't falling victim to the effect, then the creature is just boring. And it makes combat become a slog. With these new things where it's just auto inflict conditions, which again is not all the monsters. There's still monsters that if the condition is significantly bad, like paralysis or something, there's still saves involved. But for your kind of garden variety things like knock 'em prone, inflict the poison condition, stuff like that, it just happens, and that means that you can use the rest of the kit of that monster to make combat more interesting. And I think, having played a lot of different tabletop RPGs, I think that's one of the things that can trip up a lot of game designers. Is I'm a huge fan of having a lot of different conditions that exist. And what I mean by conditions are just like debuffs for the party. Everything from like the poison condition gives you disadvantage on just about everything, or prone does these different things, or maybe if you're on fire or you're bloody, just as many different conditions as can exist, because once you create that kind of condition system, you can create, for lack of a better term, conditional effects based on those conditions. Like, if the target is poisoned, then this additional thing happens. And it makes for more dynamic, more interesting encounters. It also gives the players an incentive to either cure the conditions or find ways to prevent the conditions, as opposed to, oh, I just have to have a high saving throw and then I never have to worry about this. It forces the players to actually plan around various conditions. You're fighting, ghouls. Somebody better have something that removes paralysis, or you're going to be in big trouble. Stuff like that. So that aspect in and of itself, I think, is interesting and refreshing. It doesn't mean that I think everything should just be auto hits. Like I said, there's certain conditions that they're so game breaking that there needs to be some kind of limitation on them in some way, shape, or form. And I don't think 5th edition D&D handles that aspect very well, just in general. As much as a lot of people will claim that 5th edition D&D is a combat simulator because of how many rules it has for combat, I don't think it does combat from the DM side particularly well. And that's something that's been true about D&D for a really long time. D&D, since its inception, has always been this set of rules that gives the players, for the most part, everything they need to know to be able to play their characters. But as far as DMs, they're really expected to come up with their own ways to challenge players. There's generally not a ton of rules that are specifically garnered towards giving DMs more interesting things that they can do. And a lot of times you have to homebrew it, or you just have to get creative in general. So I think this thing of just giving kind of, if you hit, this bad thing happens, this condition happens, I think that is a tool that game masters can use to create more create more interesting encounters and stuff like that. The other thing that's just kind of a theme of D&D 5.5, most of the lore is gone. They've changed lore on particular things to make it significantly more generic and bland, which I'm not a fan of. One thing I notice in particular, copper dragons, for decades, copper dragons have been kind of the trickster dragons of the metallic flight, I guess. Now they are the super friendly super friends. They just like people and they like hanging out and they're super, super cool. They completely got rid of the idea that they're cunning tricksters and they like puzzles and things like that. So stuff like that I'm not particularly fond of. I hate the fact that the lore is really, really weak and limited. You get barely a few sentences to describe most of the creatures, which isn't fun. There's a few new creatures I thought was pretty cool. I think one of them was called like an elemental chaos or something like that. Elemental catastrophe, something similar to that. That was a cool monster. There's a new slime thing that's I can't remember what it's called, but it's super cool. So stuff like that is cool. Like I said, most of the updates I think are cool. The other thing that I'm not particularly fond of, orcs don't exist in the new monster manual. Which, again, I understand the reason why they took them out of the monster manual. And the way that they basically replaced them, which is true of, they also don't have elves in there specifically. Or as far as I can tell, any of the current player races that you can play as, there are no generic monster versions of them. What they do have are these generic titles of humanoids that you can reskin as any race or any the thing that you want. They have things like mage or gladiator, bandit, and they have multiple kind of levels of them as well. Like for bandits, you have like your low bandit that's like a CR2, and then like a bandit captain who's like a CR5, and then a super awesome Coolio bandit who's like a CR9. That's cool. Again, I understand the reason why they took out specifically orcs and elves, because those are two monster types that are in the 2014 version of it. And the reason why, if anyone is wondering, is because orcs are racist. Now, for anyone going, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. They're actually not. It's been disproven over and over and over again. It's just activists have decided orcs are racist. And so they got... it's one of the reasons why there was massive changes to the lore of the orcs when you look at the 2024 Player's Guide. It was this entire kind of movement to basically say that, yeah, orcs aren't racist, and we're going to actively change how everything is so that they're not racist anymore. They were racist. They weren't. They were never racist. It was entirely projection. And now they're not racist. And in order to kind of go with that idea of orcs definitely aren't racist, we're going to not even allow you to be able to fight them unless you reskin a monster. And that way, if anything bad happens with us, because you did it wrong, not because us, because we don't think there's any bad orcs ever. Problem with that is, while there are no more orcs, there are still hobgoblins, kobolds, lizardkin, basically every other generic cannon fodder bad guy for low-level campaigns. And that was the entire purpose of orcs in early D&D, is they were generic bad guy number 7. The entire reason that orcs existed in like Lord of the Rings was they needed to be able to have bad guys that you didn't have to feel this moral quandary when the heroes were wiping them out by the just hordes of them. They wanted generic bad guy, and so they created this race. And if anyone's unfamiliar with where orcs come from as far as Tolkien mythos is concerned, actual Tolkien mythos, not the nonsense that they've been putting in Rings of Power, the orcs were actually elves that were corrupted by, and I'm going to forget it, I think the name is Morgoth, basically Sauron's like boss. He was trying to take over the world. He needed shock troops, and so he went and he corrupted a bunch of orcs, or he corrupted a bunch of elves and turned them into orcs. Now, something unique about, and they're not the only creatures that this guy created. He created this kind of teeming route of teeming horde of just evil creatures from the dark places in the earth. Things like dragons, if I remember correctly, also were a creation or they were modified effectively. And the unique thing about all these creatures is as soon as they were turned into these corrupted things, in order for him to not have to keep going back and corrupting more elves, he created them in a way that they reproduced asexually. So there are no orc families. There's not no orc mommies and daddies with little they basically reproduce kind of like amoeba. They just kind of split and are grown more than anything else. You actually see it in Lord of the Rings movies when they're creating the Uruk-hai. The Uruk-hai were not created by taking like a mommy orc and a daddy troll and putting them together in a room and then oops. No, they were genetically engineered effectively. They were created, and that's why you see them, kind of getting pulled out of the ground. They're grown, they're created. There is no reproduction for any of these things. The same thing is true about dragons. Same thing is, it's just how it works. They were just generic evil bad guys. So again, I understand their thought process behind it. It was a dumb thought process. And it removed a chance for them to create something interesting, because the other thing that's never been particularly great about just orcs as your generic bad guys is they're exactly that. They're generic bad guys. In D&D, there are very few interesting orc stat blocks in any version of D&D. They were just always, here is the kind of humanoid-sized bad guys. Kobolds are small. Orcs are bigger. Hobgoblins, if I remember correctly, are even bigger than that. Another fun fact about Tolkien, goblins and orcs are technically the same creatures. They're just halflings tended to refer to them as goblins, whereas a lot of the other mortal races referred to them as orcs. And I think there might have been regional differences to where, in certain parts of the world they're goblins, in other parts they're orcs, but they were technically the same thing in Tolkien's mythos. They were just two different words for the exact same thing. The same idea of the difference between halflings and hobbits. It was a name. Everybody else tended to call them hobbits. Hobbits themselves, or I think everyone else called them halflings, and hobbits preferred the name hobbit, because it wasn't quite as condescending as, oh, you're half a person. No, I'm a whole hobbit. So anyway, there's never really been, or at least there hasn't been many interesting orc stat blocks. They were just, this one has a bow, this one has a sword. And when we go back to the idea of stat blocks that actually revolve around conditions or other things like that, those are interesting things that the players have to actually think about. They have to actually figure out, okay, who do we want to attack first? How do we want to attack them? Generic, I attack you for 7 points of damage is not fun. And the idea of, they changed the lore of the orcs. Fine, whatever. It's done. There's nothing that's going to happen that's going to change that. However, if they had kept them as monsters as stat blocks, they could have used that new lore to create more interesting enemies to deal with. But again, we're not allowed to have evil orcs anymore or evil elves anymore, because nothing is inherently evil. There's nothing in the world that is inherently evil. Trust me, not even in a fantasy world where they were created specifically for one distinct purpose, which was to kill people. They're not inherently evil, because nothing is inherently evil. But they could have used that new lore. Like the new lore for orcs is they have almost like a wanderlust to them, where they want to go out and explore and the things like that. And so having orc characters that heavily, or orc stat blocks that heavily lean into that, like maybe some orc rangers would have turned into an interesting stat block, where that wanderlust that they're supposedly have in this new lore, if I remember correctly, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, translates to okay, well, this particular orc ranger has a beast companion, and so they constantly, anytime you use this monster stat block, it also has this other monster that you should have kind of paired with it. And that could create some interesting encounters, especially if the stat blocks refer to each other in a similar way to how, like, the Beastmaster Ranger or the new Purple Dragon Knight, which is basically the Drake Ward Ranger, but for a fighter. It allows them to kind of integrate them into kind of one complete character working together. That could have been very, very interesting. Or maybe some orc monks who just have crazy amounts of speed and do a lot of like hit and run style stuff would have been really, really cool. But now we go, no, now we just have generic bad guys that you can reflavor as anything that you want, which is fine. I don't think there was a particular kind of generic humanoid stat block that I looked at and went, ooh, that looks interesting, or ooh, that would be fun to play. But there were a lot of monstrous stat blocks where I went, ooh, this would be interesting to throw at players. So yeah, in the hopes of not offending anyone, I think they really did themselves a disservice, especially since I liked having things like elven enemy stat blocks. I thought they were cool, especially since one of my campaigns, elves, specifically Eladrin, but just elves in general, are on the bad guy, or on the enemy team in this particular setting. They're from the Elemental Plane of Air, and the Elemental Plane of Air is at war with the Feywild, where all the elves are from. So having elven stat blocks that tend to lean into elven lore, doing things like a lot of them have longbows and longswords, and Eladrin ones in particular will have like Misty Step available to them. This is all lore that creates interesting encounters and interesting stat blocks. I like stuff like that. I liked having drow stat blocks. There's no drow stat blocks in this either. Because drow had really interesting things. Like a common fighting style for drow was to use a drow long knife and a hand crossbow. And they liked to put poisons on their hand crossbow bolts. So there was a lot of different drow that they would have a melee weapon, and then they'd have like a holdout hand crossbow that they could use to poison people and do stuff like that with, which was really cool. And I enjoyed that. And it was very, very lore dependent. And I thought that was really, really cool and interesting. And I guess that's just what happens when you take away lore and stuff like that, is you also lose the ability to create interesting mechanical things based on the lore. So anyway, overall, I'm pleased with the new Monster Manual. Like I said, despite the fact that it's missing some stuff that I think could have been cool, overall, I like the new stat blocks. I think they're going to make more interesting encounters. I'm still annoyed with the fact that there is no guide to this is how you build a monster in 5th edition. And it's been out for a decade. They have certain things like, if your CR rating is this, then this is what your proficiency bonus would be. or if your monster size is this, then this is what its hit dice should be. There's a few things like that that if you really, really want to break them down, you can probably figure out the code that they use to create D&D 5th edition monsters. But they just don't outright have anywhere in the monster manual. By the way, if you want to create your own monsters, whereas things like the Dungeon Master's Guide goes into excruciating detail on this is how you make your own adventures, this is how you make your own campaigns, this is how you make your own magic items, this is how you make your own spells. Like it goes into excruciating detail about how to create everything except monsters. Which the only thing that it says is this is how you can reskin a monster. And that annoys me, especially when we've had things like Finster's Monster-matic cookbook, which had a brilliant how-to guide on this is how you create Essence 20 threats. And it's amazing. It's absolutely wonderful. I think it's phenomenal. It's one of my favorite books that they put out for Essence 20. And yeah, we can't get that. And there's so many, like Fabula Ultima. They don't even have that many monsters in the core book. They just teach you, this is how you make monsters. This is how you make bosses. It's really, really useful. Cypher System has a really, really simple to follow guide on this is how you make threats and this is how you make them interesting. Almost every other tabletop RPG that I have ever played has something in it eventually that will teach you, hey, this is how you create your own monsters for this. So you're not completely reliant on the stuff that we come up with. And 5th edition just seems to willfully not want to give us that information. And it just annoys me. I remember in 4th edition, I used to create my own monsters all the time because they had so many different ways to do it. What was it? Lancer. Lancer doesn't even give you like full-blown a monster manual. What they do is they give you classes and then they give you a bunch of different optional things. You can create your own stuff, right? Like there is no pre-generated monsters to deal with. It's all, hey, find a class that you like, customize it the way you want, and then send it in. It frustrates me that, the game is 50 years old. 5th edition specifically is almost a decade, or it is a decade old this year, and we just can't seem to get, or it's a decade old last year, I think. We just can't seem to get Wizard of the Coast to sit down and go, okay, this is the formula we use to create monsters. Anyway, that's all I have for you guys today. Let me know if you've read the new Monster Manual. If you like it, if you don't like it, all that stuff in the comments down below. I'm planning on getting some in-depth reviews done to kind of catch up on my Essence 20 backlog. We'll see how that works. Still not feeling amazing, but anyway, it's all for me today. I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.